I miss steel.
Let's go back. Back to the beginning.
Nostalgia trip.
Hi, Will.
Hi, Anna.
Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome to Nostalgia Trip. So today you have selected a unique topic for us. Can you just quickly tee off what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. We're going to be talking about comics, although I'm kind of guessing that when most people would, if I said comics, most people would jump to like, you know, Marvel and stuff like that. I mean specifically newspaper comics, so like funnies. And the three in particular that we're going to talk about are Far Side by Gary Larson, Foxtrot by Bill Amend. I'm remembering these names off the top of my head, so I'm proud of that. And then Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson.
Indeed.
There we go. I'm really proud that I got those names right.
I
because
am too.
That just came to me as I was saying them, and I'm happy that I pulled that off.
I am proud of you because I would not have done that.
Thank you. I'm going to toot my own horn immediately.
As you should. I probably only would have gotten Bill Watterson. Also, who are you to me? How do I know you?
Yeah, so I am your cousin-in-law.
Yes.
I'm your husband's cousin.
Yes. And I've known you a long time.
Yeah, I've known you for almost a decade.
Indeed.
If not a decade.
It'll be a decade this year.
There we go.
Phil and I got together. So yes, I don't think I knew you before Phil and I dated, but I knew your mom because your mom was one of my teachers as a child.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, she was a teacher like when you were in 6th grade, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
She was in like my team. She wasn't like my main teacher, but she was my science teacher.
Perfect. Yeah.
Right?
Yes. I don't know. That was a weird year for her, but
I loved your mom, and I had a really naughty class that year, and your mom loved me because I was a nice kid. So
excellent.
Your mom is great. Hi, Pam, if she listens to this. Maybe
they
she
probably
should.
will, knowing my parents. So.
Hi, Rick and Pam. Okay, so let's dive into our topic then. So let's start with Far Side.
Okay.
As you mentioned, by Gary Larson. And most of these are what we're talking about today are specifically like comic strips, right? So they're not full like books, like you said. It's not like a Marvel comic book that tells like an extensive story over several pages. These are much briefer comics, and Far Side specifically is usually like a single panel comic.
Yeah, these are like daily, like 1 to 4 panel, maybe longer on weekends kind of thing, but
right.
not a ongoing story really.
Correct.
Although like they do sometimes have like day-to-day ongoing stories, but not on the scale of like a comic book or a graphic novel or something like that.
Sure. There's some canon to that.
Yeah, they have canon. Exactly. That's a good word.
Yeah.
Which I could actually talk about because that's a whole other thing, but we'll keep going.
Well, let's talk about that soon. Yes, love that. Okay, so Far Side, just to give some background on the comic, ran from 1979 to 1995 officially, which is funny because this comic that you selected was completed several years before you were even born.
Yeah.
Which is funny to me, and that you're a fan of it. But it's still syndicated in several newspapers across the country. It's a very widely syndicated paper. And in 2020, Larson revived the comic and started creating new and on the official Far Side website. So you can still get new comics on the website. On Sundays, like you mentioned a minute ago, those are usually larger panels. So that's when they would run larger double-sided color panels. So you can get more story from Far Side on Sundays. I would say the premise of it is it's very pop culture oriented and a little weird.
Yeah, that's a good word
Lots
for
of
it.
surreal humor, making fun of social situations. And I find Far Side particularly unique because most of the characters are unnamed. There's not like a recurring named main characters in the comics.
Yeah, it's almost closer to like political cartooning. Like it's
Sure.
of the three of these, it's the closest to that, I'd say. It's not strictly political. In fact, it's not really political. It's more just like social commentary, but
Right.
But yeah, you're right. It is like a lot more individual than the other two in this list are.
And my memory of Far Side as a kid, because I was a comic strip fan as well. I loved picking up the paper, and we'll talk about that more later. But I always felt that Far Side was a little like weird and could actually be a little like OMG as you're a kid. When you were a kid, I remember seeing some of them and being like, oh my gosh, because some of it's a little dark and it can be pretty snarky. So
yeah, they can be dark. That's a good point with Far Side. I before, because I gave you this list of these, and I did like go through, because I have books of these comic strips, by the way.
Yes.
Like I have like the complete collections of them, and I was looking through Far Side, and like some of them were like, I was like, man, that's like, I'm kind of surprised that ran in the 90s in like a, you know, Wednesday newspaper. Like it's kind of dark.
Can you give an example of one that comes to mind?
I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. There's like some classic ones, because he was obsessed with cows, right? Like they
Yes,
like the characters
I have
are
that
cows.
written down.
Yeah.
Yep.
A lot of the characters are cows, and there's a lot of commentary on like slaughterhouses and like cattle, and like the kind of the analogy of people are cattle
Yes.
and stuff like that. Like that is not shied away from in some of them, and there's a lot of death in them, you know, or implied death in them and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah, there's kind of some macabre stuff. There's one I remember with like a cow turned into like a fly creature, and that art really stands out in my head of like this the 8-eyed like cow like look, you know.
Yeah, so I wrote down some of the other recurring themes that I found in researching it. People stranded on desert islands.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Aliens, lots of aliens. Like you mentioned, heaven and hell, so like lots of death themes, but specifically with heaven and hell. Cavemen as recurring
Yep, that's another. Yep,
characters.
that is one.
Medieval dungeons
Okay, yeah.
are a recurring setting.
Yeah,
for
I
the
can like
strip.
picture like torture machines in Larson style. So
Yes,
that...
I think I specifically Iron Maiden one.
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, cows. Cows are the most common recurring theme, like you mentioned, in any
Yeah.
of the strips. So, like I said, I remember this one being a little surprising when I was a kid, and I feel like it's a little bit perhaps more mature than the other two that we're about to talk about.
Yeah. These are in order of like me developing an interest in the different strips, and Far Side was like the last one that I liked as a kid, like in my past. Like this was the probably the most modern develop of an interest in one of them of the three. Fits, because I like I said, I read these really young, but Far Side was more like when I got into like my tweens and teenage years.
And in revisiting these, I really liked reading them. Because they're more mature. I mean, being in my late 20s, I loved them. I was like, this is so funny. And I went back to the website a couple times to just scroll through some of them. Because they're more mature, you really get it when you're an adult, and they hit. They're good. It's funny. The social commentary still works, even if they're from the 80s or 90s. Personally, I feel like it has aged very well.
I agree. In fact, this is funny. I follow a subreddit that is Good Boomer Humor, which I think is just a great name for a subreddit. But I think they have a rule that like straight up says you can't post Gary Larson strips because it's too easy. Because they're like they're basically just saying like they're all like that.
It's too good.
Yeah, because they all look and kind of sound like that style of like social commentary from like the late 20th century that, you know, there's this kind of a style to that. But Larson is in that style, but it feels a lot more modern to read, I feel like, or it feels more relevant than some of those other strips do from that age, you know. Because I read a lot of those, because my interest in all these strips comes like from my dad having the books of these strips around as a kid.
Sure, of course.
So I think it's interesting to see like which ones have held up like to a different audience and which ones kind of are forgotten.
And I will say, knowing your dad, it tracks that he likes Far Side. Like that
totally,
tracks.
right?
It just checks out with his sense of humor, at least as far as I know.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go into Foxtrot a little bit
Okay.
and just give a little overview of that. So like you mentioned, created by Bill Amen.
Yeah.
Launched in April of 1988. It ran 7 days a week until December 30th, 2006. So
That's wild.
That's a lot.
So much output.
it's so much output. Since 2006, still new ones, but it's only appearing on Sundays. Unlike Far Side, there are main characters, so it's the Fox family, hence Foxtrot, right? Parents Andrea and Roger, and their kids Peter, Paige, and Jason.
Yes. And their pet iguana, Quincy.
Yes. I think of all of these three, when looking them over again and revisiting them, this one makes the most sense to me as to why you love it. Like this,
Yes.
just, it's very you that you would like this. The creator of the comic was a physics major in college. He is very passionate about math and science, and that's very much a theme in several of the comics. To put it simply, these are deeply nerdy comic strips and delightfully funny in how deeply nerdy they are, and it just really makes sense as to why you would like them.
You know, it's really funny that you like described that, because that would have been very far down on my list of things to say about this comic strip, but I think it's because it just fits me so well, it doesn't even stand out. You know, like I'm just reading it and like, yeah, this is just existence, sure. You know, like, because like to me, what I was going to say about Foxtrot, because it follows this family, and it kind of is a little sitcom-y, you know? Like, it kind of has that
Yes.
vibe of, like, the 80s family sitcom, you know?
Yes.
Like the Family Matters kind of style, but in comic strip form. And that's the thing that always stands out to me. But you're right. They are deeply nerdy. In fact, there's a whole book of them that is, like, all of the most nerdy ones isolated into a single book, which is... So, yeah. No, I see what you mean.
But they're great. And I'm also a pretty nerdy person, and I'm very proud of it. These are very fun to read, and I think calling it a sitcom is a really good comparison. They're definitely structured in that sense. It's often like someone enters a room and one of the kids is doing something silly. It's often stuff like that, right? Or the kid is working on their homework and the dad says something silly and it's a joke. Like, it's stuff like that that's a little cutesy and on the nose, but often tied into math and science or broader life concepts, which makes it also kind of educational.
Yeah, exactly. And also because of the floating timeline in it, right? The three kids, Jason, Paige, and Peter, they don't age, right? Peter is always a junior in high school, Paige is always a freshman, and Jason is always some arbitrary, like, elementary grade, like late elementary, middle school grade.
Yes.
And they just float in that. So that's the other thing that feels incredibly sitcom-y, is that you just go through so many tropes of the situations that, you know, suburban, middle-class America high schools and stuff like that, that teen movie kind of vibe. They just hit every one of those points, but in its own kind of way, you know, like it's done every trope because it's run for so long, and that really makes it feel like the sitcom to me, because it's like, oh, look at this family they're going camping, or, like, you know, they're gonna have a detective episode or something like that. You know, you feel those same tropes.
Right. I would compare Foxtrot to Bob's Burgers, which I adore Bob's Burgers. I don't know if you do or have watched it, but
I haven't watched much of it, but I know enough about it to see where you're coming from.
Yeah, to me, again, being a massive fan of Bob's Burgers, it's the similar family vibe, and where it's not the classic sitcom where it's like the parents are a little annoying and the kids aren't super close to the parents, and like that's where a lot of the like comedic tension comes from. It's like the parents in this are really cool and you like them and you feel connected to them in the same way that you feel connected to the kids, and I think that's what makes Bob's Burgers really good too. And the relationship that they have with each other as a family is very fun, and I think that comes through in both Foxtrot and Bob's Burgers. So I just personally noticed that as someone who wasn't wildly familiar with Foxtrot before doing some research on this, and I found it very delightful and pleasant.
Yeah, it's a very pleasant comic strip. It's just easy to read and it's fun. You know, it's not trying to say a lot, but it doesn't need to.
Also, I wanted to shout out, clearly Bill Amend is a massive Lord of the Rings fan, because there are so many mentions of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, he very clearly is a big fan of, like, nerd culture. That is definitely true. Like, the specific references that he makes to things, particularly, like, clearly a nerd, too, like, that grew up in, like, the late 20th century. Because, like, there'll be references to, like, there's large sections about, you know, Jaws and Jurassic Park and like even predating like Lord of the Rings and stuff like that.
Right. I think too, it's important to contextualize for the listeners who maybe don't know you as well, why you might like this comic strip a lot. You are also very good at math and science. It has to do with your career path. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that is relevant to why you probably like this.
Yeah, sure. And it's worth noting too that Foxtrot is like my first love of these comic strips, by the way. Like I started reading Foxtrot. This in truth, Foxtrot is kind of what got me into reading in a lot of true ways. Yeah, no, I grew up as like a pretty nerdy kid. I had parents that were pretty pro education and like science and math and stuff like that, and other forms of education too, but particularly my dad was big on STEM education, and that just kind of spilled over into me. So I don't really remember a time that I wasn't like self-identifying as like the nerdy kid. I'm totally okay with that,
as you should be.
It's worked out for me. But yeah, and it, you know, and it led to me going into robotics and then eventually software engineering and stuff like that. So it gave me a career and something to do, so that's fun. But yeah, and particularly the youngest kid, which keep in mind, like I said, so I started reading these when I was in like second, third grade, I think is when I got into Foxtrot, and then through the rest of like until now. And Jason, the youngest son, who I think is like 10 in the books, is like an incredibly like over the top nerdy character. He's like Stewie from Family Guy, but way before that.
Sure.
And not like in that like same annoying tone. But he's the 10-year-old that's doing physics and stuff like that trope. But it's clearly like Bill Amen's self-insert character as well, in my opinion. And yeah, there was definitely a part of that of like identifying with Jason as a character and wanting to have that math and sciencey kind of like self-identity, I think.
I can definitely see that checks out. And for the listeners, because I just did an episode with Phil, who is your cousin. My husband is your cousin.
Oh yeah.
And he talks about the cousins in his episode, and so if you listen to his episode, you will kind of understand maybe where Will fits into that picture, being the youngest cousin. So that's a nice little tie-in to the episodes as well.
Yeah, because that's a good point too. Jason was because I'm an only child, but Jason was the youngest of the family, and I was the youngest of our cousin group. So that's definitely also another part of like identifying with that character.
Yeah, and Phil talks about how you guys were, I mean, basically siblings despite being cousins. Yeah. So definitely similar,
that is definitely true.
Familial roles there. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Calvin and Hobbes, because it's Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, so, it is Calvin and Hobbes.
Created by Bill Watterson, ran from 1985 to 1995. Of course, follows Calvin, a precocious 6-year-old, and Hobbes, his stuffed tiger. If you, for some reason, do not know as a listener, Calvin believes that Hobbes is real, and they go on fun adventures together. And to the rest of the world, Hobbes is just a stuffed toy, and this is a source of humor throughout the comics. To me, this is the most quintessential American comic strip. My family is a huge Calvin and Hobbes family. I am so obsessed with Calvin and Hobbes. I have every single one of the book collections in my living room. I adore them. They have sold 45 million copies of these books worldwide. It is an absolute phenomenon. Can you talk a little bit about Calvin and Hobbes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great description of it. Calvin and Hobbes, it almost feels like this is barely a comic strip in the way that some of these other comic strips are comic strips. Like, it really was clearly, like, Bill Watterson making the most of his medium, I feel like, with these strips. Like, they are just really good. Like, just genuinely quite good. And I don't know how much you know about, like, Bill Watterson as a person, or if you've read
I was going to mention
his, like,
him
writing.
A little bit. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I was going to say, like, because that's another thing I love about, if you have the books of Calvin and Hobbes, a lot of them, like the 10th anniversary or the complete collection and stuff like that, come with a lot of just Bill Watterson's, like, writings about life in the front of them. And I think that makes Calvin and Hobbes better, if you know a little bit about Bill Watterson and his personality and his opinions on things, because it just so clearly, it makes the topics talked about in the strip very obvious, like, why he was writing the strips that he was writing.
Absolutely.
So Calvin and Hobbes, for me at least, was one that, like, I remember it not making a lot of sense. In fact, actually, no, I remember there's a Foxtrot panel that makes fun of Calvin and Hobbes a bit, where it shows where Peter gets a bunch of Calvin and Hobbes. It's just a single panel comic strip that, like, ran on Christmas or something, and it shows, like, the outside of their house, and it's tipping to one side, and, like, half the house is up in the air, and it's Andy saying to Peter, like, can you please move some of your Calvin and Hobbes books to the other side of the house, and, like, playing, like, you know, like saying, like, why are the books so ridiculously, like, emotionally heavy and, like, more meaningful than any other comic strip, which I think is a great little nod
is lovely
to Watterson. But
yes,
I mean, Calvin and Hobbes, it's a mix of, like, feel good. It's like you read it and it's just so agreeable. You know, it's just very, it's a very, like, yeah, that is just how the world is kind of, like, comic strip.
Yes.
And it makes you feel, like, in agreeance with it in, like, very fun ways, I feel like.
Absolutely. And for me, I feel like my family used this as a tool to learn about life. Like, we were just given a Calvin and Hobbes book and we're like, read this. And everyone in my family did that. Like, my sister's much older than me, so she also grew up as a child reading Calvin and Hobbes. And I feel like that's just what my parents' parenting style was like, read Calvin and Hobbes.
I don't even think that's a bad parenting style. Like, I think that would work.
No, I agree.
Very well.
I think it's I agree. My sister has done it with her kids as well, and I think it's a great way I think it's a lovely way to explain life, because there's some really thoughtful situations that are put in these comics that help, I think, explain some of life's complications in really sensitive ways. And yeah, I think Calvin and Hobbes is very lovely. I did want to talk a little bit more about Bill Watterson, because he's a very interesting figure. He
is. He's the kind of guy that's a lot of what he is, I feel like. You know?
Yes, and he also is extraordinarily private.
Yes.
He does not make public appearances. He took a lot of breaks from creating Calvin and Hobbes, even at the height of its popularity. Like, he would just simply stop making them for a while because he wanted to. And, you know, being perhaps one of the biggest comic strips in the history of America, other than maybe Peanuts and Archie, you know, there's been a lot of asks to adapt it into a TV show and a movie, and he's always outright refused. He absolutely will not let it become anything other than what it already is.
Yeah, there was zero merchandising on Calvin and Hobbes. I think like the one thing he's ever greenlit was like a T-shirt for like a charity.
Right.
Like he is very, very in control of that IP. It's never been syndicated and stuff like that. Like and stuff. So it's very remarkable.
Yeah, I read that there were inquiries from Jim Henson, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas all offering to adapt into, and he said nope. So, I mean, if you're turning those guys down, you're never going to change your mind, right? But
yeah, exactly. Who do you trust if not them?
My question for you was, do you think that is what makes it as special as it is?
So here's the thing. I didn't know that when I first read Calvin and Hobbes.
Sure.
And it was still really good.
Right.
You
yeah,
know?
Sure.
I think it is very good in its own right. And this is what I meant by when I said, like, I think knowing a bit of Bill Watterson's story, like, makes them even more enjoyable as comic strips and more meaningful, because it's like they stand on their own so strongly. But then when you look at, like, what Watterson was saying with them and how clearly passionate he was about them and how much he views this as, like, the thing he did in his life and how important it is to him and how pure it feels to him, that seems like very hard to not respect and very hard to not like agree with. Again, to be like, yeah, that is how this should be.
I agree. I'm with you. Okay. Well, that was our summary of the comics. So now let's take a little break for a game, shall we?
Okay.
So this game is called Birthday Bash.
Okay.
We're going to party like it's 1999 with some trivia questions about the year that you were born, which was 1999.
This is going to go very interestingly, I feel like.
I'm rooting for you. Okay. Question number 1. Who was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1999?
Oh, Anna, come on now. I have no clue. 1999. See, here's the thing is that I have a very notable gap from about 1985 until like 2010 when I like kind of became aware again. So I'm not going to be very good at this.
This person is a highly powerful man to this day, particularly in the sector of e-commerce.
Oh gosh. Okay. Wait. Okay, wait. E-commerce. I'm going to guess you've got like a either eBay or Amazon or something in that era. Mm-hmm. Okay, Elon Musk. That's a eBay founder, or you have Bezos as an Amazon founder. But they weren't even commerce at that time. They were books at that time. But
are one of those people one of your guesses?
I'll go with Musk just because why not?
That is not correct.
Okay. Who is it?
It was Bezos.
No, okay. I had it 50-50.
You were so close.
I was really close. Okay. Well.
Okay. Let's do one that I think you can get this. Okay. Which installment of the Harry Potter book series was released on July 8th, 1999?
Oh, I should be able to get this. Book series. Okay, I have to do some... Okay, so Philosopher's Stone was 94? Oh, God.
Note that you call it Philosopher's Stone because you're such an OG fan that you know that that's the actual name of the book. Yes.
And, okay, I'm going to guess Prisoner of Azkaban.
It is Prisoner of Azkaban.
Okay.
Good job.
Okay, that was a guess, but that was an educated guess.
Okay. What was the number 1 movie of 1999?
Ooh. That's a good question. I have no idea.
It is part of one of the biggest like franchises of all time.
Okay, 99. That's too early for Lord of the Rings, right?
It is slightly too early for Lord of the Rings.
Oh, okay. Well, and it's... Oh, is it Phantom Menace?
It is Phantom Menace.
Yes,
good job.
Okay, there we go. Thank you for the
hint.
proud
of you.
But
I also want to give a shout out to listeners. If you're looking for a book suggestion, read the book Best Movie Year Ever. It is making the argument that 1999 is the greatest movie year of all time, and it was a really good read.
Okay, that's interesting. I will look that up.
Shout out to that. Okay, what decade-defining music festival from earlier in the 20th century was revamped in 1999 to disastrous results?
I'm going to go with Woodstock.
It was Woodstock. Woodstock 99 was an absolute shit show.
I think I've heard that before, but I...
Watch the Netflix documentary on it. It was really interesting.
Okay, maybe that's
Check it
why
out.
I've heard of it, if there's a Netflix documentary.
You should watch it. Okay, last question.
Okay.
Which music file sharing system was launched in 1999?
Napster?
Napster.
Yeah.
Good job!
There we
You did
go.
great.
Okay, yeah, I got it.
You partied Legos 99 really well.
Let's
Okay. Let's get back to some nostalgia, and then we'll do one more game.
Okay.
So, going back to these comic books, what medium did you read these comic books in? Like, did your parents get like a daily paper that you read them in? The Sunday paper?
Okay, no.
Did you read them
in
in collections?
Yeah, so I read them in printed book collections. And I honestly think that is very, like, pivotal to my enjoyment of these strips, particularly Foxtrot, more so than the other two. Because, like I said, like, they have these continuing stories in them. And how I also mentioned briefly, like, these Foxtrot is kind of what got me into reading.
Right.
And I genuinely think, because it was kind of, like, I was in second grade, and I was a good reader, but I just didn't really care about books. And this was, like, the first thing that was, oh, look, there's an ongoing story, and there's characters that I know and identify with and enjoy being a part of in a way that isn't TV, you know? But because it was that same, like, kind of slapsticky, sitcom-y humor in a comic strip, it was like an easy transition from a cartoon obsessed second grader into like a colorful comic strip and fun drawings and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But being able to basically binge read them, I think, was very pivotal to that. Of like,
Right.
I have, you know, I have memories of my first memories of reading like Foxtrot is sitting in bed next to my dad, and he's reading them, and I'm reading them like over his arms and shoulders, and like reading them along with him. And I can remember like asking questions about like, what's that word mean, or stuff like that. So I have memories that predate my ability to read like a weekly cartoon like comic with my dad. So I think having the books was really big. Also, you know this about me, but for the podcast, I grew up going up to my family cottage every summer, and that was like a pretty isolated experience for quite a bit of my childhood. Like I had my cousins there, and that was great, but we did have, I mean, this even before the internet, but even once the internet became a thing, and I was away from all of my friends that like I went to school with and stuff like that. And I have a lot of memories of like reading Foxtrot up at the cabin, like outside, or waiting at my parents at work and stuff like that, and reading these collections of books, or like riding around in cars and carrying these comic strip books with me.
Yeah.
Or this is funny too, like, you know, before cell phones, we had these books next to every toilet in our house. You know, and so like you don't have a phone to take to the bathroom with you, and I'll pick up a Foxtrot book and read Foxtrot while I'm in the bathroom, which is
right, because we didn't have phones to take into the bathroom with us.
Yeah, exactly. So like you're just either sitting there looking around, or it's like, well, I guess we'll keep comic strip books in our bathrooms, and that was like, and that's still a thing. If you go to my house, like there are still comic strips in our bathrooms.
You do have comic strip books in your bathrooms.
Yeah, no, that is the thing. You can attest to that.
That's actually a great bathroom book though, because it takes like a small amount of time to read a full comic strip.
Yeah, exactly. You can just burn through them, and I think that was also a factor of these that I really liked, was that, you know, reading one is nothing, but reading a bunch of them is still valid. Like you can sit down and read 100 comic strips in a row, or you can read 2 and be satisfied with it, you know. But anyway, to answer your original question, my intro to them was with books and collections of them.
Sure.
And it wasn't until I got a little bit older that I either looked at them online in like a more like daily release format, or occasionally at newspapers, although most of them were in syndication like by the time I was a fan of them.
Right, because again, you are a bit younger than me. I do remember them being syndicated when I was little. I think my parents only got the Sunday paper it was the Eaton Rapids paper on Sundays, and I always would run over and rip out the comic section, and there were definitely several strips. Like I remember reading Dilbert and Garfield. Garfield was my favorite when I was really little, and then before I got into Calvin and Hobbes, I think. So my next question was, you know, a lot of comics, like we were saying, are not syndicated anymore. And, you know, print media in general is kind of dying out, and that's impacting the popularity of comic strips, and it's a little bit sad. But on the flip side, a lot of comics and graphic novels are kind of having a resurgence right now in different formats, particularly because of, you know, comic book movies being really big, and that's helping out, I think, a lot of different forms of comics. But do you see maybe resurgence in the future of these classic comics? Where do you think they're going? Do you think that it's kind of a dying art? Sure.
Like, I don't know if you'll ever get comic strip that is as widely viewed as Calvin and Hobbes is, you know,
Right.
again. But to be fair, that's kind of true with all media. You know, you also don't get shows that are as widely viewed as Friends anymore. You don't get movies that are as widely viewed even. Well, you get movies
Right.
a little bit, but you know what I mean? Like, as
It's not the same,
media,
yeah.
as media has become more niche, your total viewership goes down. And the death of like print media and newspapers like that is definitely also going to be a big factor, because the reality is a lot of these comic strips ended up in people's lives incidentally. You know, it was an accident that people
Sure.
would read these because they were getting the newspaper for other
Right.
things. Versus now, one way or the other, you probably have to seek them out, which is a much different, you know, thing to do.
Right.
Which I think is in some ways good, because it probably means that more artists, more graphic artists and comics drawers and stuff like that can probably survive because they can find an audience that is more suited to them. But at the same time, you do lose like this kind of
Right.
certain level of common shared knowledge of the strip, and like that like sense of like, oh, did you read the Calvin and Hobbes yesterday? You know, like that kind of does go away to an extent.
The water cooler
Yeah,
talk.
exactly. And I feel like
yeah.
that's just kind of the reality of, like I said, with like a lot of stuff now, is that media is less
Definitely.
shared among everyone and is more like specific to your interests, which is probably good in a lot of ways. I think it's interesting because maybe, you know, everyone doesn't get like an input of something like Calvin and Hobbes, which might be very different than the things that other people read or see, which is an interesting thought, you know, like as content becomes like more algorithmic and stuff like that, and it's more driven towards what exactly we want to see. There's some kind of amusement to me in the idea of random entertainment that you just kind of see by accident and like is a way to find new things.
Right.
I think that's a very like
Right.
interesting difference between old media and now modern media, particularly with like the rise of like TikTok style content where you don't even decide to watch it, you decide to stop watching it.
Right.
You know?
That's
Which
a
is so
great way to put
different
it.
than
Yeah.
the old style of like, I'm going to sit down and find a thing to watch and something like that. But in some ways it's honestly like closer to what I'm describing, right? It's just a random feed of content that maybe you're interested in, maybe you're not. But I think that the place for that shared experience though is something that I think would be cool to see again. I don't know how you would do it, but I do like the idea of connecting a lot
Yeah.
of people through like a shared thing, and I feel like that happens a lot less now, particularly with like written content, with like books and comics or whatever that, you know, your source of that is that there's just so much
Definitely.
stuff published. You could infinitely find your own stuff.
Well, I was going
and,
to say,
you
but
know.
I agree with you, and I think younger generations do crave the connection that you can get through things like comic strips or other media, and it's not the same. And I have to think that there will be a new way for that shared experience to emerge that will be
Yeah.
a little bit more personal than maybe what we have right now. I don't know what that looks like. I agree with you that I think maybe there is an opportunity for that to come back at some point.
I agree. I think too, I mean, even, you know, the nature of comics being like a daily thing or a weekly thing, depending on the comic strip. I mean, it's interesting to see, you know, with like TV shows, we've gone from weekly releases to seasonal.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be interesting to see if maybe the death of daily comics, which they do still exist. I'd like to be
Correct.
clear. Like, there are still funny pages, but I don't know anyone that reads them, to
No.
be fair. That at least that is my own age. And so it'll be interesting to see, though, if, like, does that come back in some way, and, like, what does that look like? And I guess to an extent, you know, you have places like Reddit and things like that that could facilitate
That community.
some
Yeah.
version of that.
Yeah.
But even that, I don't know, how often do people look at like who's making a thing anymore, even on the internet? You know, how much is it just a scrolling headline or a scrolling meme that you see and then move on from, and there's no connection to like, oh, maybe this
Right.
is part of a series, you know? So like that very thing that I
Unfortunately,
liked
all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. So that very thing that we talked about being interesting about these, about like motifs of them or continuing stories or a larger ideology or something like that, that is going to be something that's really hard to convey in like a modern comic audience, because unless you're someone following specific artists where I don't know where you'd even get that, you know?
Yeah, if you saw, Bill Watterson was posting on Instagram different clips from Calvin and Hobbes, like, you're not going to get the full picture of what Calvin and Hobbes is saying.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're only seeing one single frame of the strip, right? All these pieces and parts of how we consume media now aren't necessarily conducive to the magic that comes from some of these comics.
Yeah, and even that, to like see Bill Watterson's content on Instagram, you probably have to either be a fan of like him or comics for it to get recommended
Correct.
to you, like
You're already
still
part of that
doesn't
niche community. Yeah.
Yeah, it still doesn't hit like that broader audience to
Right.
like bring people in the way that it brought me in as like as a 10-year-old. I don't know
Right.
how
Yeah.
I don't know if the average 10-year-old these days would have an exposure vector to Calvin and Hobbes, or something like it.
Right. Well, with that, I think that's a nice little end to our nostalgic discussion. But I wanted to transition into our next game.
Okay.
Which kind of goes off what we were just discussing, because I've started
Okay.
asking guests to share with me some other things that they're nostalgic about from their childhoods, just as a little nice wrap up to our conversation. And in your answer, it made me feel really old, first of all, and reminded me that you are indeed younger than me, because you said that you have a lot of nostalgia for Skype. And I was like, oh my God, I used Skype in frickin' high school and college.
Yes.
So that's
I'd like to be clear. I also nostalgia for high school, which was not that long ago for me,
I
but-
was like, I'm old. And then you also said Nickelodeon shows that were on in the summers when I didn't have internet at the cabin. And that also made me feel old because I didn't stream anything on any internet platform until I was also in college. I was like, oh my God, I'm so old.
That's fair. I didn't even think about that with like in context of streaming, to be honest. I thought of that in context of me being like stuck at the cabin with no one to talk to.
Okay, fair. Fair.
But you're right. I watched whatever was on, and what was on was whatever DirecTV satellite TV could
Sure.
give us, that way. So
But the two of the shows that you shouted out were Back at the Barnyard and Penguins of Madagascar, both banger
Yes.
shows from Nickelodeon. But the connection that I made with both of these shows is that both of them had mediocre to average video game adaptations that I played as a kid.
Okay.
And so I
Okay.
thought for our final game, I would have you listen to some audio clips from cutscenes of different mediocre to average video game adaptations of children's entertainment from when we were kids.
perfect.
So I've pulled
Perfect.
3 audio clips from 3 different games that have to do with children's film and TV from when we were kids. And I would like you to listen to the clip. So select clip number 1, give it a listen, and then try to guess for me. If you can guess the name of the full name of the game, I'll be very impressed. But if you can just give me the show that it's connected to, that will count as a win.
Okay.
Say hello to my little bubble friend.
Okay. Well, it's SpongeBob is the show.
It is SpongeBob. Yes.
There was a SpongeBob game called like Attack on Bikini Bottom, I think, but I don't know.
It is Battle for Bikini Bottom. That is correct.
Okay, there we go.
Ding, 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 ding.
I never played that game, but I know a lot of people who loved that game.
This
So-
game is an absolute banger. So this one I would actually not consider mediocre to average. This game is a banger. I have probably put 100 hours into this game on my PS2 when I was a kid.
Okay.
It slaps. And I actually think that they it's called like the refresh or something. They like redid the game recently and made it good.
Okay.
More modern. So anyway, good job on clip number 1. Why don't you give a listen to clip number 2?
Okay.
Are you having fun? Because I'm having fun.
The voices in this are so amusing.
I'm a green, mean fighting machine.
Is it Shrek?
It is Shrek. It is actually from Shrek 2, the game. And my God, is the gameplay in this so bad. It is just them. It's just so the characters in the clip are Donkey, Fiona, and Shrek. Fiona has like 40 different catchphrases that she keeps shouting out while they're like in combat. Like, you heard the phrases that she was saying. She's just saying all kinds of weird, random stuff. And all they're doing is, like, jumping in the air and, like, collecting coins while, like, jumping on top of bad guys. It's not good. It's not good. I don't know what's happening. It's weird gameplay. Anyway, good job. Clip number 3. Oh, what were you
wait.
gonna say?
I
Go
want to
ahead.
say one thing about the Shrek game, though.
Absolutely.
Do you know if this was a GameCube game?
It was
this-
a GameCube game.
Okay,
Yes.
I do think I played this game. I have a distinct memory, but not, again, like, I didn't have a lot of, like, game consoles as a kid. Like, I got into games, but later in life.
Sure.
I had a DS, and that was about it. But I would go over to friends' houses and play this, and I have a distinct memory of playing this like weird open world Shrek game on the GameCube, where you're like walking around far, far away land, doing weird things, and like battling far, far away land.
Yeah.
And
I'm pretty sure that's this game.
Okay, great, because this just unlocked some memory for me.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'll listen
You're
to
welcome.
clip 3 now, though.
Clip 3.
Either I hit my head harder than I thought, or you're the rat that helped me with the soup. Doesn't...
Okay, I have a pretty good guess for this one. Is it Ratatouille?
It is the Ratatouille
Excellent.
game. Yes, this is the cutscene where the rat meets what's his name? It's Remy, and then what's the guy's name? Linguini. Yes, of course. Yes, this is a cutscene from that game. I really wanted to pull a clip from the Avatar: The Last Airbender game, but there is such little dialogue in the game, and all they're doing is running around, of course, like using their powers, but all of the like things that they say where they're fighting were like, you fight like a girl, and it was like the stupidest stuff ever. I'm like, you would never in a million years be able to guess that it was Avatar. But that was another like silly childhood game that I really wanted to pull a clip from. So good job, you nailed it, 100%.
There you go. I did it.
Good job. So
that was great. I like your games. The games
it gives some spice it up.
It does.
So final thoughts on what we talked about today. Final thoughts on what makes this nostalgic for you. You know, why did you pick this as your topic?
That's a great question. Yeah, so when you asked me like to pick something that I'm nostalgic about, I feel like I'm a pretty nostalgic person, to be completely honest. Like I
Sure.
really do I really do feel a lot of nostalgia to a whole lot of things. But which is so fun. Like it feels so self-important to say as a 23-year-old person. But no, but that said, the thing that about Foxtrot and Calvin and Hobbes and Far Side that stand out to me is just that they were like this thing that kind of got me into other media. You know, I'm someone who I watch a lot of media, I listen to a lot of media, I read a lot of media. Like I'm a pretty media-driven person and really enjoy content like that. And this is like one of the first ones for me. This is like one of the first things that I remember being, particularly Foxtrot, is like one of the first things that I remember being kind of obsessive over to a degree, like obsessive media over. And I have so many memories of the books. I can picture so many of them. I can quote so many of the panels. And it just feels very central to a lot of my thoughts on early media in my life, which are the things that I definitely feel a lot of nostalgia to. And the connections that they have with my dad, too, is definitely a big part of that because, you know, growing up, I spent so much time with my dad and stuff like that, and his opinion on books and media and stuff like that are still really important to me. And so this was like one of the first ones, you know, one of the first things that he kind of passed on to me, and it was a thing that we shared and talked about, and that was just always really great. And it was also something that I was into that a lot of other kids weren't, so it made me feel special, you know, like, and it was kind of a slightly unique thing, and it was something that I could talk about and stuff like that, which as a slightly more shy kid was also cool for me and stuff like that. But I don't know, I just really like this, and there's something with, for me, nostalgia connects to feel goodness, you know, like things that just have very pure happy, or at least naively happy memories. And these are all things that just, there's no negative connotation to any of these. I still read them and they still make me happy, and they're still just purely fun memories for me and purely fun things in my life, which is more and more rare with media, I feel like.
And becomes unfortunately more rare just as you grow up, I think.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
But that's what nostalgia's about. I'm so glad that you remember these fondly, and I think it was a great selection. So thanks for talking about it with me today. This was really fun. Thank you for joining me.
I had a great time. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome back anytime.
All right. I've got plenty more things that I'm nostalgic about. I can talk about Skype and make you feel old. So
amazing. Anytime. I don't mind feeling old. That's what this show's about. So
great.
Well, thanks, Will, for joining me. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thank you.
You grow up, I think.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
But that's what nostalgia's about. I'm so glad that you remember these fondly, and I think it was a great selection. So thanks for talking about it with me today. This was really fun. Thank you for joining me.
I had a great time. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome back anytime.
All right. I've got plenty more things that I'm nostalgic about.
Amazing.
I can talk about Skype and make you feel old. So
amazing. Anytime. I don't mind feeling old. That's what this show's about. So
great.
Well, thanks, Will, for joining me. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on this nostalgia trip. If you liked what you heard, follow the podcast to keep tripping through time with us. And if you're feeling extra supportive, leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. follow us on Instagram at NostalgiaTripPod for bonus content, episode release schedules, and more. Want to hear a certain topic or have a recommendation for the pod? Email us at nostalgiatrippod@gmail.com. Until next time!